Hi, I'm Ben, and in this video I'll be giving you an in-depth look at a sample library I created called Shadow Strings. In the first part of this video, we'll go over each of the controls in the interface, and in the second part we'll check out all the sounds. The patch panel gives you access to all the sounds in the library. Most patches contain a handful of articulations. You can choose these articulations with the white dots or using key switches. Each articulation has a description with pertinent info you might need or want. For example, the tempo synced articulations show what BPM they were originally recorded at. The controls at the bottom are different for each patch. Only the most interesting and useful controls are exposed. The blue slider adds sub, and the yellow slider adds distortion to crunch the high and low sounds together. On the bottom, there are basic controls for envelope, delay, reverb, and EQ. If you want to customize the delay and reverb, there are more controls under the cog. The reverb and delay have the standard controls you'd find anywhere else. The reverb panel has a couple of extra options though. Shadow Strings Reverb uses Realm. It's a newer addition to Kontakt, and you can choose between Realm's airy and grounded modes. Shadow mode gives you more of a wet sound by nulling out the dry signal with a phase-inverted copy. There are also menus from which you can choose a handful of presets. The EQ's cog menu has 3 routing options. With post distortion, EQ happens after the yellow slider's distortion. EQing the distorted sound might be useful if you want to tame it or maybe accentuate the sizzle. With pre-distortion, EQ happens before the yellow slider's distortion. This means the EQ will have a big effect on how the high and low frequencies crunch together. The last option is called Pre-Distortion Don't Affect Sub. There's a decent amount of low end in the samples. You could high pass that with the EQ, however, then you would lose the sub. This option works around that. An added advantage is that if you high pass the samples but not the sub, then when they both hit the distortion, they sometimes distort more cleanly. Using the interface's controls, you can get a wide range of sounds. It can be distracting to have to familiarize yourself with a new interface while writing music though. This is why I made the NKI presets. The NKI presets are organized into 2 main folders, Basic and Designed. The basic presets are useful if you want a more natural, unprocessed sound. You can add your own delays, reverbs, and EQs to the chain after Kontakt. The designed presets were made to demonstrate how far the samples could be pushed using the built-in effects and controls. Neither of the sustain articulations use vibrato. This gives them a colder, more ominous sound. All of the interest was generated by subtly changing the bow's speed, pressure, and placement over time. For the gentle articulations, random frequent bow changes create a gently undulating texture. Whisper layers in the ponticello from each of the 3 cellos. The subs are pitched down versions of the samples. For the harsh articulation, slow, steady bowing creates tension and suspense. Cello 1 was made in 2018 by a maker in Minnesota named Frederick Bethke. It has a refined sound which projects cleanly. It's the cello I perform with in acoustic situations. Cello 2 was made in China sometime in the 2000s. It has a rich, warm sound. It's tuned down a half step for all the recordings to warm the sound up even more. It has a realist pickup under the bridge, so this is the cello I use for amplified situations, maybe playing with a band. Cello 3 was made in Louisville, Kentucky in 1954. It has a rustic quality to it, which has been brought out even more by tuning it down a whole step. There are 3 types of tremolo, and you can crossfade between them using the tone knob. The first one is airy over the fingerboard. The second one is healthy, halfway between fingerboard and bridge. The last one is spidery, close to the bridge. The sub is made using a sine wave whose volume is modulated by a slow LFO. Layering 3 cellos together, the swells have an ensemble feel. The 2-bar swells have a bow change. If you play softly, though, there won't be any bow change. Stretch adjusts how samples sync to the DAW's BPM. Because there's no vibrato in the samples, time stretching them this much actually sounds okay. The sub uses a key-tracked peaking filter to boost the fundamental frequency. Turn on legato, and when you play overlapping notes, new notes will start however far into the sample the old notes were. One way to use this is to change chords at the peak of the swell. The whisper articulation is a swell created by sliding the stick of the bow across the strings. This technique creates an indistinct tone as if the cello is whispering. The sub uses a key-tracked bandpass filter to boost the fundamental frequency of the samples pitched down an octave. The 3 knobs at the bottom mix together copies of the samples in different octaves. A single note by itself will have a noticeable swell. If you turn all these knobs up and play chords though, all the voices blur together to make a hazy wash of sound. The loops are multi-sampled and consist of repeated notes bowed and plucked rhythmically. Some repetitions are quite soft and weak sounding. Other repetitions might stick out unexpectedly. This style of playing lends itself especially well to delay and reverb. The performances are not meant to be consistent across keys. Each key will sound a little different. If you play multiple keys at once, you can hear the dynamics of each sample changing independently. The idea is that by holding just one or two keys, you could create an improvisatory sounding texture which stays fresh and interesting for quite some time. Stretch adjusts how samples sync to the DAW's BPM. Samples can be stretched to half speed and double speed. This is handy if you want to avoid time stretching too much at fast or slow BPMs. You can also choose the 0.75 times or 1.5 times speed, and this just turns duplets into triplets. Shape envelopes the loops rhythmically. Turn the shape knob to the right to envelope with a downward saw LFO. Turn the shape knob to the left to envelope with an upward saw LFO. Note that the percussive loops only have the downward saw option. Quantize is short for input quantize. This could be done easily with any DAW, but it's just such a useful function for these particular articulations that I put it in the patch panel for convenience. When you strum the strings of a piano, you get a very edgy, twangy sound, slightly reminiscent of a hammered dulcimer. It's the perfect sound for this type of library, so it was included even though it is a bit of an outlier since everything else is cello. The piano loops were recorded 2 different ways and then edited into 4 articulations. All of the piano samples are doubled and panned. This makes the stereo image swim around your head, especially if you're wearing headphones. They also sound like they have reverb baked in. This isn't reverb though. Everything was recorded with the sustain pedal down. For the picked articulation, piano strings were gently strummed with a guitar pick. For the picked harmonics, strings were strummed with a pick while touching their halfway point. For the low blue keys, the repeated notes are not actually picked. They're played regularly with the hammers, and then instead of just touching the halfway point, I touched all different places on the string to create motion over the course of the loop. The piano's action creates an intricate texture of small noises. The mics were placed close to the hammers so you could hear this, and if you boost the highs, you can bring this texture out. Synth waveforms weren't working as well for a sub, Instead, copies of the sample are pitch shifted down an octave and layered in. The sustained quarters are the slowest bowed articulations. The bowing pattern starts with an up bow and lets it slide down towards the bridge. Then, right before changing, the bow speeds up a bunch and gets pushed almost on top of the bridge. Quickly changing bow direction at this point creates a bright percussive accent. Doing this repeatedly, it's almost impossible to get it to sound the same every time. Every time it's a surprise, and this is what keeps the loops interesting over time. The subs are a simple sustained sine wave an octave or two below the samples, and it's been side-chained to each sample. Having the sub gently pulsate with each sample can make for an interesting ebb and flow between the low and high frequencies, and it also makes the distortion sound pretty cool. For the gentle articulation, accents coax out random partials more gently. For the stabbed articulation, the accents stab out random partials above the played pitch. Playing in eighth notes, the bow can be drawn faster and lighter, which makes it possible to put more air in the sound. The brushed articulation has anxious bow changes and a feathery sound. The stabbed articulation is a bit more violent. Playing close to the bridge, the high partials just really jump out. For the octaves, I'm just sliding between octaves without real concern about whether or not it's a clean slide. The slides between the octaves are really drawn out and accented. When playing in 16th notes, the bow interacts with the string in some unique ways, and bouncing is possible. These articulations work well when played in chords. For the brushed articulation, the bow agitatedly whispers across the strings, creating ephemeral high harmonics. Sometimes the pitch is entirely lost, and all that can be heard is the breathy noise from the bow hair. When the bow is kept in close contact with the string while brushing, there's this way to whip the bow around when changing direction, which sounds pretty interesting. It creates this kind of percussive low thump. For the sub, these thumps are recreated with a synth. The overall volume of those synthesized thumps is then side-chained to each sample. For the bounced articulation, the bow softly scuffs the strings. Playing sixteenths at this BPM, if the bow stays close and low to the strings, it can be bounced off the string just a tiny bit, which creates this hushed energy in the sound. The subsamples were made by using the low sine wave thumps again. The hammered articulation is recorded in octaves so that it can be played more aggressively without bumping into other strings. As you can see, it's basically impossible to only hammer like this on one string. The goal was to hit both strings hard enough that they'd slap against the fingerboard every once in a while, adding a bit of extra crack to the sound. The sub is made by applying a tempo-synced sawtooth LFO to a sine wave. Subs on all percussive cello and piano loops consist of pitched down versions of the samples. The plucked and picked quarters feel rather ponderous to me. I really like how clean the pick sounds on the high notes. The plucked and picked eighths have a hushed quality to them. Plucked and picked octaves might seem unnecessary. However, there is just something unique about the octaves being in one take. For chiff, the bow bounces very vertically. On lower notes, it almost sounds as if the bow is plucking the string. could use the stretch knob to turn duplet articulations into triplets. When playing triplets in real life, though, you just feel the rhythm differently. It was difficult to play continuous 16th notes accurately, especially with a pick. Instead, they were recorded in groups of 2 with space in between. The plan was to edit out the spaces, but it turned out the spaces were quite nice to have, so they were left in. When you leave lots of space, you can play more notes at once without the texture becoming as busy. It also leaves more room for interesting rhythms and arpeggiated sequences to happen. The one exception to this is with the octave plucks. Those do have continuous soft strumming. For chug, the bow has no side-to-side motion, and the strings are damped to keep them from ringing at all. It's just all crunch. Chug is useful for layering under other articulations and giving them more grit. There's only one sample in this articulation, and it's stretched over the whole range. In a sample library, you usually want the samples to stay in tune. The bends are this library's way to play in the cracks and have expressive intonation. The scoops and leers never comfortably reach the half step above or below. To make the subs, basic wave shapes were pitched and enveloped to fit with the played samples. Normale bends have a saw wave. Harmonics bends have a sine wave. And ponticello bends have a square wave. The falls have a whispered fade in, then a foreboding descent into the depths. There are two dynamics which are mapped to separate octaves on the keyboard. Droop mournfully sighs. It almost makes it down the half step. Fingered harmonics create a light wispy sound full of air. All of the bends could be reversed, and it is kind of entertaining. Droop, though, is particularly useful when it's reversed, so it's included as its own articulation. There are 2-second, 8-second, and 12-second long risers, each as separate articulations. Different variations are mapped across the keyboard so they can be layered together easily. The first group is Normale. The second group is Tremolo. And the third group is Ponticello. The notes in each group play different pitched risers. The lowest string of the cello was tuned down an octave to make the lowest pitched riser even lower. It didn't make sense for the risers to have a sub, so instead, the blue and yellow sliders are used as a chopper effect. The blue slider adjusts the amount, and the yellow slider adjusts the speed. With legato switched on, new risers will start in sync with risers already playing. You could, for instance, start on a low-pitched riser, but then add a higher-pitched one partway through, so the riser would seem to cover a larger pitch range. Note that the attack time of the risers is also determined by velocity. Sample start is useful if you need to shorten risers. Reverse, as the name implies, reverses the samples. There's just one hits articulation. It contains a collection of layered sounds mapped across the keyboard in 3 groups. These sounds were created by exploring what kinds of strange noises I could make with the cello, then finding interesting ways to layer them. I sorted them by intensity so they could be mapped to different velocities. The first group has the shortest sounds. The last group has the longest ones. The middle group is somewhere in between. A handful of the samples from the sound design session worked particularly well when pitched way down. They sounded really boomy, and so I used those for the sub layers. For the reverses, samples of varying lengths are mapped across the keyboard. This way, it's easy to mash keys on your keyboard, exploring and layering sounds. There's a set of 5 unpitched whisking sounds, which are duplicated onto every octave of black keys. The sub for the reverses is made the same way as the hits. It's a handful of samples, which just worked particularly well, pitched way down. The problem with layering different length reverses together is that you would usually want all the samples to reach their peak at the same time. The length knob makes this possible. It introduces silence or starts playback further into the sample so that however long the recording is, it will reach its peak at the set number of beats. Quantize is useful because often you'd want reverses to reach their peak on a downbeat. Arps are tempo-synced arpeggios which use a mysterious pattern of minor thirds and half steps played in short fragments. The harmonics articulations use something called fingered harmonics, which is where you hold down the string with one finger, then lightly touch that string further up to get a high whistling tone. With fingered harmonics, you can only change notes by moving your whole hand. As a result, there's a little bit of portamento between every note. The Ponticello articulations use a technique where you bow close to the bridge to get a spidery sound. There are 2 ways to play the arpeggios, as fragments or as arcs. For the fragments, low velocities trigger a fragment going down, and high velocities trigger a fragment going up. Arcs consist of fragments edited together outside of Kontakt to make this big arc going over the entire range of the cello. Stretch adjusts how samples sync to the DAW's BPM. Sample start is most useful for the arcs. You could, for example, make the arcs start at their highest point. The subs consist of the samples just pitched down an octave. Because the pattern is so vague harmonically, the arps can fit into many different keys. Play them over any chord progression, and it'll often create enigmatic harmonies you wouldn't otherwise think of.
you.